I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Gemma Rygate. I'm the CEO of the Centre for Volunteering, which is based in New South Wales. And we have some of our members in the room. We've got three fantastic speakers, and the title of today's session is less than exciting, but the speakers are really fantastic, and I'm sure many of you know them already. Our first two speakers are from SEEK. We have Rebecca Miller, who is Head of SEEK Volunteer, and Matt Cowgill, the Senior Economist for SEEK. Rebecca has been leading SEEK Volunteer for over 5 years, and prior to that, led a number of social impact programs for NAB. SEEK Volunteer has been connecting volunteers with volunteer involving organisations for 23 years, making it one of the longest social impact investments of a technology company in Australia. Her co-presenter is Matt Cowgill. Matt is SEEK's Senior Economist. He's previously worked as Chief Technical Advisor at the UN's International Labour Organisation, as a Senior Researcher at Grattan Institute, and as a Senior Executive in the Victorian Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions. SEEK is Australia's most visited employment site. Welcome to Matt and Rebecca.
Hi everyone. I just wanted to do a secondary introduction to Matt as to why we're rolling him out today. So I have been at SEEK for 4 or 5 years, and SEEK Volunteer has a lot of rich data and insights. And one of the things that Matt has been doing for SEEK Employment over the last 12 months is really looking at the unique data and insights and providing some great information to government and media around the employment context and trends that we're seeing. And so one of the things that myself and Katrina and Matt and my team do is we constantly have this lens on where is SEEK Volunteer the same as SEEK from a volunteer and employment context, and where are we different? And where we're the same, it's great because we can leverage this huge brains trust to actually solve our challenges. But the flag is then, where are we different? And we double down on our own challenges. So I asked Matt to come along today and share some of the great statistics and insights that he has around the 4 words that we're all hearing, which is high uninflation and low unemployment, and to share his insights around that. And then I'll come back and talk to you about some, I guess, insights around the volunteer context. So over to Matt.
Thanks very much, Beck. So as has already been mentioned, I'm going to be talking through a little bit about the kind of labour market context, about the labour market in Australia. I think this affects volunteering organisations from 2 sides. So it both affects sort of how many people are likely to express interest in volunteering opportunities in any given month. And it also, of course, affects the sort of demand for services from community organisations as well. When unemployment is high or there are cost of living challenges, I don't have to tell the people in this room that you faced increased demand for your services. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about the state of the labour market as it is today, a little bit about expectations for the period ahead, about how that might affect volunteering and the outlook there, and hand back to Beck to elaborate further on that. Okay. So first of all, I mean, the state of the labour market can essentially be summed up in the fact that the unemployment rate is the lowest it's been since 1974. I didn't expect that we would ever see an unemployment rate with a 3 in front of it in my lifetime, and I'm not that young at this point. We had never seen that before. So the lowest it got since the 1970s was in early 2008. It just grazed 4% before the financial crisis dragged it back up again. But in the past year or so, we've absolutely smashed through that 4% barrier, hit 3.4 a few months ago, and now at 3.5. So still super low. We're well below pre-COVID levels as well. So before COVID hit, the unemployment rate was sitting at about 5.1%, and we're still well below there. So if you think about that, that means we have a fair way to the unemployment rate could rise quite a bit and still be below where it was pre-COVID, still be better than that pre-COVID level. When we talk about the unemployment rate, people often have questions about like, well, what about kind of other measures, underemployment and so on? The short story is every indicator is more or less pointing in the same direction at the moment. So it doesn't matter which indicator you look at. The employment to population ratio, which just very simply tells us what proportion of the adult population is in work, that is literally the highest it's ever been. The participation rate, which is what proportion of adults are either in work or actively looking for work, that is literally the highest it has ever been in Australia's history. The underemployment rate isn't quite at an all-time low, but it's at a multi-decade low. It's at the lowest it's been since the very early 1990s. Other indicators as well point in the same way. No matter which indicator you look at, this is a super tight labour market, by which I mean there is very strong demand for labour, and that demand for labour is kind of outstripping labour supply. We see that in our data at SEEK as well. So what we're looking at here is, the colours aren't quite coming through here, but the pink line, if you can make that out, tells us the change in SEEK job ads since February 2020, so just before COVID. And the other line, the blue line, is the average number of applications that we get per job ad at SEEK. At the moment, I'm just talking about a job ad, so not SEEK volunteer opportunities, but sort of paid employment opportunities. And what we've seen is in the first half of last year, every single month was a new all-time record for the number of job ads at SEEK. Every month, new all-time record, and not just by a bit, but by a lot, like way more job ads than ever before. And the flip side of that equation was the average number of applications per job ad absolutely fell through the floor. So on average, job ads, you would know this from stepping into local cafes and seeing the help wanted signs on the windows, or perhaps from your own organisations. It's been very difficult to find people. That has started to turn around in the last sort of 8 months or so. It kind of peaked around May, June, and has turned since then. So we still have dramatically more job ads than we had before COVID, 38% up on February 2020 levels. And we're still getting fewer applications per job ad than we were before COVID. But both those things have started to sort of come back to normal, and we are coming back to normal. But just remember, like when we were talking about with the unemployment rate, we're so far, it's such a tighter labour market, a hotter labour market than it was pre-COVID. We could go a long way back towards normal and still kind of have a tighter market than we did in that pre-COVID period. There we go. So these two, the fact that we're seeing lots of job ads at SEEK kind of goes together with the low unemployment rate. I realise this is a bit of a wonky chart. Bear with me on this one. So each of these little dots is an individual month worth of data, with the data here going back to 2009. And we're looking at, along the left to right axis is the unemployment rate. So towards the left is lower unemployment. And along the vertical axis is how many job ads we have on SEEK relative to the size of the labour market. So when we go up, we've got more job ads. And we see a pretty strong, pretty consistent relationship. When unemployment goes down, job ads go up, just as you'd expect. And that's what we've seen over this last year or so. We've seen unemployment hit those near 50-year lows, as I mentioned, and job ads smash records as well. Similarly, when we look at the relationship between the unemployment rate and applications per ad, we see a reasonably stable kind of relationship there, which is when unemployment is lower, we get fewer applications for each job ad. When unemployment is higher, we get more applications. Exactly what you'd expect. This will connect more to volunteering a little bit later. I have something to show you specifically on the volunteering picture. The point being, kind of, as I said before, that all these indicators are kind of pointing in the same way. There's not often with kind of labour market analysis or economic analysis, the famous thing of economists is you say on the one hand and on the other hand, and you can never get us to give you a straight answer. At the moment, there is really only just one hand. It's a super tight labour market. Labour demand is really strong. Every indicator is pointing in the same way. Okay, so that's kind of where we are and where we've been in the labour market. Look at a little bit about what we can expect over the year ahead. The clicker works. There we go. All right, so everybody's aware inflation's going crazy, 7.75% last year, which is the fastest since the very early 90s. Inflation's expected to stay high, so it's not expected to come back to the Reserve Bank's kind of target range for a few years. And as a result, interest rates are expected to go a little bit higher and to stay there for an extended period as well. And that is going to have an effect on the labour market. So in large part because of this, because inflation is high, which is pushing up interest rates, those higher interest rates are going to affect the labour market. They're going to push up unemployment. They're going to push down employment growth. And that is what people, including the Reserve Bank themselves, are forecasting for the year ahead. So unemployment at the moment is 3.5%, as I mentioned. The RBA expects that'll be 3.8% at this year, at the end of 2023. So that's only a fairly modest rise. Remember, we were at 5.1 pre-COVID, so still well below pre-COVID levels. Other economists, when they get surveyed by the Financial Review, slightly more pessimistic than the RBA, but only a little bit. So the median economist in this survey has us at 4.2% at the end of the year. So again, this is kind of like a soft landing. It's maybe a bit of a return to normal, but it's still a much hotter labour market than we regarded as normal in 2019 or before. So the point being here, if anybody is expecting some, we put this COVID period behind us and expecting a kind of rapid return to what we saw in 2019 in terms of what's going on in the economy, what's going on in the labour market, that should not be your expectation. It's certainly possible that unemployment might rise faster than is forecast here, but I think it's notable that not a single one of these, I think 32 economists surveyed by the Financial Review, expects unemployment this year to go above 5%. So nobody, even the most pessimistic economist here, still has unemployment below that pre-COVID level at the end of this year. Sorry, I seem to have to click this a couple of times. All right, wages. So what's happening with wages? Long story short, not very much. So wages are, as people might know, they are starting to pick up a little bit, but still being vastly outpaced by inflation. So in last year, wages grew by about 3.1%, inflation of 7.75%. That means they're going backwards in real terms, so the purchasing power of wages is falling. But they are expected to keep picking up. So wages growth has risen. That 3.1% is modest, but it's still faster than we've seen for a number of years. And forecasters, including the bank, expect the wage price index, the main wages measure, to keep picking up, but still, picking up to circa 4% or in the low 4s. So still well below where inflation's running at the moment. We have our own measure of advertised salaries called the SEEK Advertised Salary Index. That's the pink line you can see at the top there. That measures the change in the salaries for positions that are advertised on SEEK. That's been running a bit hotter than overall wages, 4.6% in the year to December, reflecting the fact that it is a super tight labour market. There's a bit of a bidding war for workers going on out there, and people are having to pay more to attract staff. And slowly the ABS wage price index measure is catching up there. Point being, wages growth is low. It's well below inflation, but it is expected to pick up and inflation's expected to fall. So, if we can believe the forecast, in 2 or 3 years' time, we might just start to see wages growth outpace inflation. And I think this is important as well when we think about both the kind of demand and supply side of equation for volunteers, is that workers are feeling the pinch. So there is a genuine kind of cost of living crunch going on where people's real wages are falling. That probably means that at the margin, people are wanting to put in more hours of paid work, which might affect the kind of hours that they have available for volunteering opportunities, and also obviously affects the kind of demand for services from community organisations, as you'd be aware. To connect all this back to volunteering, so I have to say I'm sort of ignorant of the context here. I did used to work for WACOS way back in the midst of time, so I have worked in the community sector briefly, but not across the data here. But I decided to have a look for my own interest. I don't have to tell anybody that the kind of census numbers were a bit shocking. So a reasonably chunky fall in the number of people who said that they do formal volunteering, so volunteering for a group or organisation in 2021. This is the proportion of adults who gave a valid response to that question. So 15% of those said they do volunteer in 2021. I wondered whether this was just to do with the lockdowns, because the census was carried out while Sydney and Melbourne were in lockdown, obviously going to affect things. So I had a look at what the data looks like when you take Sydney and Melbourne out, and it's basically the same story. So if you take Sydney and Melbourne out, everything shifts up a bit. Apparently, people outside Sydney and Melbourne seem to be slightly more likely to volunteer on average. But the fall is much the same. So that kind of trend over time is much the same. So it's not the lockdown story driving that. So that had me wonder then, well, if we've seen this pretty sharp fall in the proportion of people who are volunteering, like, is that driven by particular demographic groups? And the answer seems to be no. So what we're looking at here is the pink line is 2016 in each of these panels, and the blue line is 2021. And we're looking at women along the top row, men along the bottom row, divided into each age group. And we're looking at the proportion within that, for females of a particular age in each year, what proportion of people volunteer. And the upshot is that at basically every demographic group, women and men, young and old, in work, unemployed or not in the labour force, people are volunteering at a lower rate in 2021 than they were in 2016. Again, this isn't kind of lockdown driven. So I don't have I'm sure people in this room have better theories than I do about what might be driving this, and I'm sure this isn't news to you, but it is kind of striking. One other kind of interesting thing that jumps out to me here is the middle panel. So these are people who are unemployed and what proportion of them volunteer. Volunteering rates among the unemployed look to be higher than they are for people either in work or not in the labour force. And that kind of gives us a double blow, because there's fewer unemployed people now than there have been at basically any other time in the past 50 years, right? So not only are people within each demographic group less likely to volunteer, but we've had this kind of compositional shift away from the group, unemployed people, who are more likely to volunteer. When we look at Seek volunteer data as well, it tells a similar story. So this is a kind of similar to the charts we were looking at earlier with the Seek job ad data. Each of these dots represents a year of Seek volunteer data, kind of averaged over the year. Along the left to right axis is the unemployment rate. So towards the left is a lower unemployment rate. And the vertical axis shows the number of expressions of interest that Seek volunteer receives per 1,000 people in the population, so just adjusted for population growth. And, the relationship here isn't perfect, but we do see this generally upward sloping relationship, so that when unemployment is higher, we see more expressions of interest. When unemployment is lower, we see fewer expressions of interest. The implication being, remember, unemployment is expected to stay very low. It's expected to rise a bit, but still remain very low. So we should be more or less expecting the current situation of relatively few expressions of interest, at least compared to the past, to persist into the future. And I'll hand back to Beth. Thank you.
So I just have two slides to finish with. This is the last graph you will see, I promise. The last one just has words on it. So what I thought I would share with you, just following on from Matt's slide around expressions of interest from Seek Volunteer, is just a little bit of a graph around the history of our data for the last 4 years. So the top, you can see the colours, the top grey peak there was actually the eastern bushfires in the southern states of Australia. And what we see, even though we don't have disaster response opportunities, we see a real willingness and desire of people wanting to volunteer. So we saw a peak in expressions of interest then, and it stayed reasonably high. But then what you see from the grey, if you jump to the light blue, But that one there, we've seen a steady decline in the last 12 months, pretty much. And I feel like a broken record internally to my boss saying we are seeing the lowest level of expressions of interest for the last 12 months that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years. So part of my reason of sort of chatting to Matt internally was that, is it something we've been blaming COVID for 2 years? Is it something we're doing? And what do we, when we think about the next 2 or 3 years, what do we need to focus on? But what you'll see there on the right-hand side is visits to our overall Seek Volunteer site aren't down that much, just 4% year on year, which is not that significant. We have got the ad volume from you guys, that's up 8% year on year. So I'm not telling you anything you don't already know around the need for volunteers, but you know, it's that 17% year on year decline that we've seen from last year to this year with expressions of interest. So my insights to you, I guess, are around just considering, you know, I guess it's reasonable to expect that the volunteer recruitment challenges, nothing new, are going to be sort of significant for the next couple of years. So consider this in your strategies, Volunteering Australia in their 3-year action plan. But I guess the two things still remain, and we've seen this year on year, that cost to volunteer and time commitment have always been and will continue to be the biggest challenges. So from a cost perspective, I checked the New South Wales State of Volunteering report, and it was only 35% of organisations have a reimbursement strategy. So really start to think about those things that you can put in place to reduce the cost to volunteer, while that wage growth, you know, isn't growing as fast as inflation. And then secondly, and we've been saying this for a while, and you know, around that sort of more flexible opportunities as time becomes a little bit more precious and people are looking to spend any spare time they might have in the paid work. So from a Seek Volunteer perspective, just to finish, I guess from our perspective, it's what can we do? So we're not going to throw money at trying to drive more volunteers to the platform. They're coming, but we're not converting them to an actual expression of interest. So those that we are converting though and sending them off to you guys as an expression of interest, one thing that we've recently done is added I guess a field on our expression of interest form where they can put their Seek profile link. So it's essentially a link to their Seek CV that they have for employment. So what that means a volunteer can now do is pass more information to you about themselves. So while they're interested, while they've expressed interest, and you can see information more than just first name, surname and the basic stuff, we're seeing about 10% of expressions of interest now use that link. You'll get more information about them and hopefully be able to place them in a role faster and know that they're suited to it, because it'll have more information like what they would apply for in a job, so some skills, education and other things. So we've done that. And the second thing we're doing is really just focusing on that on-site conversion. So think of yourself when you go online to shop for clothes or shoes or whatever, like, you know, I do a lot of browsing. And what the awesome thing about running a tech platform is we can tag every single page and really see where people are dropping off and where we're losing them. And what we've discovered is of the people that are coming to our site, only about 50% are just browsing that search results page. They're not clicking on an opportunity. So that's our big focus area for the next couple of months, is how do we get them to click through to opportunities? Things like the way that volunteer roles are titled. How do we make them more digestible and more appealing? So we've just done a piece of work where around about 15 role titles will probably account for 50% of our volunteer opportunities. They're driver roles, they're board roles, they're this, but the way they're dropped into the title isn't always digestible for the volunteer. So that's our focus as a team, to try to make those roles more discoverable for the volunteers. And the second one, which we don't do, we'll have to look into and it'll take a little while, is we've sort of been thinking about if a volunteer is coming to Seek Volunteer, they've got capacity now. So how do we surface those roles where you guys have got vacancies in the next week or the next month? Bit different, we don't capture that from you, so we've got to start from scratch, but how do we capture their interest more in the moment and surface things that are coming up in the very near future? So that's a taste of two things that I thought that I would share with you today, but that's where you'll see us focusing our attention in the next few months. So that is all from us. I'd like to thank Matt, and in the interest of time, hand back to Gemma. I think we're going to do questions at the very end, so thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca and Matt, and we will take questions on their presentation at the end. But it's now my pleasure to introduce Amy Williams, Principal Lawyer with Justice Connect's not-for-profit law program. Amy was admitted to practice as a solicitor in 2015 and commenced her legal career with the law firm Cause Chambers Westgarth. As a lawyer at Justice Connect, Amy regularly provides legal advice, training and assistance to community organisations across Australia on various legal issues, including legal issues relating to volunteer management. Amy sits on the board of Volunteering Australia, and prior to becoming a solicitor, Amy was a social worker working with a range of small to medium-sized not-for-profit organisations. Please welcome Amy.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here. So I'll start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge that this is, and always will be Aboriginal land. So I work for an organisation called Justice Connect. We are an accredited community legal centre and a registered charity. We have offices in Sydney and in Melbourne and lawyers across Australia. We also have about 50 member law firms, which means we have access to about 10,000 pro bono lawyers who help us deliver our services. And our role is to design high impact interventions to make sure that we're continuing to provide legal support to disadvantaged individuals, but also to the community organisations that are supporting those individuals, which brings me to the team that I work for, so not-for-profit law. So we provide free legal information, free legal advice, free pro bono referrals and low-cost training to community organisations across Australia. And the idea is that by helping organisations understand their legal responsibilities, by helping organisations be well governed, by helping organisations understand what their obligations are to their people, you guys can get along with just doing your business and getting out to delivering your mission without having to worry about complicated legal issues. So each year, our service receives hundreds of legal questions from volunteer involving organisations, and that means that we have to be across the legal issues affecting the sector now, but also the legal issues that are coming up. Which leads me to the topic for today. So top legal issues for 2023. These are not the only legal issues that you need to be worrying about, but these are certainly the legal issues that I guess there's a lot of law reform being undertaken at the moment. There's a lot of government attention being focused on these areas of law. And I guess there's also a lot of public attention as well too. Now, my aim today is to give you a little bit of a taster of each of these areas of law, give you some tips so that when you're going back into looking at your volunteer programs, when you're thinking about how you're managing your volunteers or designing or I guess monitoring or reviewing your programs, you have these issues in the back of your mind. My aim is not to overwhelm you. I think sometimes these legal sessions can be a little bit overwhelming, and we as lawyers take ourselves very seriously and we love to talk about risk. I don't want you to be thinking about this as a whole nother set of obligations. I also want you to be thinking about this as improving the volunteer experience, because each of these areas of law are really important to making sure that our volunteers are safe and they have a wonderful experience when they're volunteering with these organisations. So think about it from that perspective as well too. It's really important for me to mention that this is legal information only and not legal advice. Everything I'm saying, I've got 20 minutes and these are really complicated legal topics, so it's very general, okay? And I am on the board of Volunteering Australia, but today I'm well and truly wearing my Justice Connect hat too, so I just wanted to point that out. Wouldn't be a legal session without a disclaimer. So first topic, changes to workplace health and safety laws. So broadly speaking, Australia's work health and safety laws apply to community organisations and the volunteers that volunteer with them. In legal speak, they apply to PCBUs, or persons conducting a business or undertaking. I promise I'm not going to get too legal on you today. But essentially what that means is if you have one employee in your organisation, even if they're a part-time bookkeeper that works for you half a day a month, these laws will apply to you. If you are completely volunteer run, that is you have no employees, or you don't manage a workplace where there are employees, these laws technically don't apply to you. That doesn't mean that you can run riot and forget about people's safety, but just wanted to keep that in the back of your mind. If you are completely volunteer run and you have a question about that, I'm very happy to answer it in the question section at the end of today. So these work health and safety laws tell us that the basic legal responsibility of community organisations is to ensure the work health and safety of its workers and the people that its workers are interacting with. So volunteers and the people that your volunteers are interacting with. Now we're starting to see the law with, I guess, progress to what we already know to be true, and that is that people's mental safety is just as important as people's physical safety. So last year, there was a whole lot of reform to the national work health and safety regulations. And those laws were reformed to make it clear that there's a duty on PCBUs or community organisations, if you have an employee, to manage psychosocial hazards in the workplace. What is a psychosocial hazard? It's basically anything that can cause psychological harm. Some examples up on the screen there. And the thinking is that repeated exposure to these types of hazards causes stress, and stress causes psychological harm. And the basic legal duty is to eliminate these hazards if it's practical to eliminate them, often not practical to do that. So the next layer to the duty is to minimise the impact to your workers as a result of these hazards. So we're starting late last year, early this year, and as we move through 2023, the states and territories are starting to adopt this duty to manage psychosocial hazards in the workplace into their legislation. As we move through 2023, I would be surprised if we didn't see those jurisdictions with a no next to it adopt legislation very similar. I know that we'll have a lot more guidance from regulators about these issues, so there'll be a lot more information out there for you about what is a psychosocial hazard and what do you need to do to manage it. And there'll probably be a lot more court cases as well too, which is a good thing, not for the people involved, but it's a good thing for us so that we can start to understand the parameters of our legal obligations. So what does this mean for you? I think the first thing to acknowledge is that our volunteers can and will come in contact with those psychosocial hazards. So by the very nature of our sector, it means that, sometimes our volunteers are exposed to traumatic material. Sometimes they are overloaded. Sometimes they're underloaded as well too. And that is actually seen to be a psychosocial hazard as well. Sometimes there's poor supervision. It's just the nature of the way that our sector operates. So we know that our volunteers are going to be exposed to these hazards. I think that means we do need to be proactive and thinking about psychosocial hazards when we're planning our volunteer programs. And one way to do that is to start to think about your psychosocial hazards in the same way that we do physical risks. So we know that we have first aid officers. We know that if there's a big puddle on the floor here, there'd be a big caution sign here. We know about ergonomic desk setup, but we don't necessarily think about psychosocial hazards in the same way. So we need to start to shift our thinking. We might have a physical risk register. Do we have psychological risks on that register as well too? I also think that we're going to start to see volunteers expecting this as well too. As there's more dialogue about what psychosocial hazards are, I think volunteers will start to expect to volunteer for places where this is taken seriously. So just one to keep in the back of our minds. So as you move through 2020, I spent so long trying to get that blue line under cycle. That's such a shame. As I work for a community legal centre, you've got to do everything yourself, and I clearly can't even do that. How and where can you improve your volunteering programs to ensure the psychological safety of your volunteers? Just keeping this in the back of your mind as you're designing your volunteer programs. Next topic, sexual harassment laws. So as a result of the Respect at Work reforms, we've had significant legal reform to the laws that deal with sexual harassment and discrimination based on sex in the workplace. So we now have federal legislation that makes it clear that the legal protections against sexual harassment and discrimination based on sex extend to volunteers, which is a huge advocacy win. That did not exist a couple of years ago at a federal level. And it's definitely as a result of the advocacy of Volunteering Peaks, Volunteering Australia, Justice Connected, lots of submissions on this as well too, and I'm sure other people in the room did. So huge advocacy win. The other thing that we have as a result of these changes is a really clear positive duty on those PCBUs again, so persons conducting a business or undertaking, a community organisation with employees, to eliminate sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace. So the sexual harassment laws were updated in 2021 to extend that definition of worker to include volunteer, which was a huge shift. But they were also amended to put this positive duty on organisations to eliminate sexual harassment, eliminate discrimination based on sex, eliminate harassment based on sex, eliminate hostile working environments that make it difficult for people based on sex, and also to eliminate victimisation. So that's retaliation for making a complaint about sexual harassment or discrimination based on sex. The Fair Work Act was also amended. You might think, Fair Work Act, what does that have to do with volunteers? Well, the Fair Work Act was amended to include volunteers in the Stop Sexual Harassment provisions, which is pretty special. So normally only employees have rights under the Fair Work Act. But the Fair Work Act was amended to ensure that volunteers can apply to the Fair Work Commission and apply for a Stop Sexual Harassment order, which is a really amazing win for volunteers. The Act was also amended to make it unlawful for a person to sexually harass another person in connection with work. That might seem really obvious to us, but that just wasn't in the legislation at all. So this is a huge win and a huge shift forward. Importantly, another person includes a volunteer, and it applies to a volunteer in the context of recruitment, and that wasn't clear before, which is a really big win. So if a volunteer is applying for a role, these laws protect them. It applies in the context of a volunteer volunteering, and it also applies in the context of the way someone's behaviour is towards that volunteer. So if a client is sexually harassing a volunteer, these laws protect them. In connection with work, we know from COVID that's a very, very broad definition. If you can find some sort of connection to work, these laws will probably pick up on it. So what does that mean? I think the first point is that this is a huge win. This kind of shift is a huge win for our sector to have volunteers recognised in the same ways as employees. And I think that also means that we kind of have a bit of a duty to step up and make sure that we do our best to eliminate some of this conduct. I think the other thing is that we're really practiced, or I hope we're practiced, in being responsive to this type of behaviour. So if someone in your organisation made a complaint about sexual harassment, we know that we need to do something about it. What we're less practiced in is being proactive about it. And that's what this legislation is requiring of us, to take positive steps to prevent conduct before it even occurs. And I mentioned this earlier, but volunteers now have a really clear external path to making a complaint. So they can go to the Fair Work Commission and ask the Fair Work Commission to intervene. I think that's obviously only going to happen, though, if your organisation isn't dealing with it properly. So just one thing to keep in the back of your mind. So think of that blue line. I want you to be thinking about the positive steps you could be taking. What do I mean by positive steps? A policy, training, having your senior leadership talk about how this conduct isn't acceptable, having really clear paths for people to make a complaint or to raise behaviour that they don't think is acceptable, and telling people that there is no, if they do make a complaint, there's no issue if they do. They're not going to be punished if they do. So making that really, really clear. They're the kinds of, that's what the law means by positive steps. And the Respect at Work, and I'll talk about this more at the end, but the Respect at Work website has amazing resources to help organisations implement these types of things. Everything I'm talking about today will be backed up by more resources. So on to the third and final quick little overview of some things that you need to be aware of. Privacy and data security laws. So we in Australia have laws that protect the collection, disclosure, use and access to people's personal information, and that's predominantly regulated through the Privacy Act, which is a Commonwealth piece of legislation. It will apply to a community organisation if they earn if there's an annual revenue of over 3 million in a year, or if you collect health information, or if you have a government funding contract. So it does actually capture a lot of community organisations. The Privacy Act, it protects personal information, and that includes things like contact details, name, racial, ethnic origin, political opinion, sexual orientation, criminal history status, disability status, medical history. So it covers a lot of personal information. And I think that's the type of personal information that we very often collect from our volunteers when they're signing up, but also that our volunteers are exposed to by the very nature of the work that we're performing. So we're just keeping that in the back of our mind. We've got Privacy Act, a lot of organisations are covered by it, and our volunteers are either handing that information over to us or being exposed to it. We've all seen a lot of data breaches in the media recently, so there is a lot of focus on this as an area of law at the moment. Last year, the Privacy Act, in response to this kind of focus, last year, this is not law yet, so just be careful. And I know that you're going to get a copy of these slides as well too. The Privacy Act was amended to increase the civil penalties, so it's like $50 million now, obviously only for very, very severe offences. And it's also the regulator has more powers to intervene. Now, the Privacy Act is still being reviewed, and these are some of the things that they're thinking about changing in the Privacy Act. All you need to know is, as a result of this Privacy Act review, it's probably going to cover a lot more community organisations. So that 3 million revenue threshold will probably be dropped. It will cover, it'll have more types of personal information will be covered. I think that we'll see more obligations on organisations, and I think that we'll see more rights for individuals who want to make a complaint about their privacy being breached. So we know that's probably where these changes are heading. So what does that mean for you? We've got to be proactive about this. And I think about when we're thinking about being proactive, I think we need to get realistic about the fact that the not-for-profit sector is, and there is research, more vulnerable to these types of privacy breaches than the private and government sector. There are 3 reasons that are cited for that. The first being that we're very often more likely to put more of our resources into delivering mission as opposed to having robust IT systems or training people in privacy. We're more likely to have a part-time workforce or a volunteer workforce, and therefore it's harder to upskill people in these areas, and we're more likely to use our personal devices. So they're the 3 reasons that our sector is more vulnerable to these types of attacks or breaches. I don't know if that's going to be acceptable for much longer. So I think we just start to need to think about this as a sector. You know, one thing that we think about it not-for-profit law is in government funding contracts. If government's, you know, paying us to deliver a service where we're collecting people's personal information, how can they also pay for a little bit of our ability to sort of up our IT systems or up our privacy approaches as well too? So I think we just need to start thinking about how can we invest in this. We always say, regardless of whether or not you're over that 3 million revenue or you don't have a government funding contract, you should be complying with these privacy laws as a matter of best practice. They're all really common sense. They're not hard to comply with. And I also think that people are going to start to expect this of us. Our clients are going to expect this of us, but our volunteers might as well too. So whenever I volunteer, this might be really lawyery, nerdy of me, I always look at a personal collection information statement to just see, you know, whether or not they've covered off on all the things. And if I get the sense that they're not, then I kind of get a sense that I know what their culture is around privacy. And so can we, when we're collecting our volunteers' personal information, demonstrate that privacy is important? We care about their privacy, and then hopefully that translates into the work that they're doing within your organisation. Sorry, this clicker. I encourage you to think about in 2023, how are your volunteers interacting with personal information? Where are your kind of gaps? Do they even know about the Privacy Act? Do they know that they have obligations? I don't know, do they know that you have a privacy policy? Just have a think about that. So, this really hasn't translated, has it? Need more help. So all of these regulators have a phenomenal amount of information on their website. The OAIC has draft privacy policies, how to draft a notifiable data breach plan. It really lays it out really simply what your obligations are. All those regulators have a lot of information about psychosocial hazards. And as I said before, the Respect at Work website has a lot of information about sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace. We also have a lot of information. So we have hundreds of legal resources on these topics. You might be eligible for legal advice through our service. We also do deliver legal training on this topic, and we have in March, we're delivering a webinar. It's about $30 and anyone in your organisation can listen to it for 2 weeks. And we've got experts from Hive Legal coming in to talk about cybersecurity and data breach and what organisations can do. So there is legal training out there on this. That's it for me. I'll hand back over. Oh, just Blake, you went.
Questions?
That was a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
So. I've got a tricky one for you. From you. Just because I've had this argument myself, like Meals on Wheels Queensland, we obviously hold a lot of data about our clients. Had the discussion with My Aged Care and our funding arrangement managers. So My Aged Care sits under Department of Health, fundraising, funding arrangement managers. They've changed their title too many times in the last couple of years. Sit under Department of Social Services. So one is our client referral place, one is our reporting place. I've had the conversation with our funding arrangement managers about how far does the privacy collection statement from My Aged Care, which sits with a particular department, move across to our reporting. So if our clients have said they don't want us to use their details for reporting, we put them as unidentified. Had the argument with our fam that that's their choice. But she's saying, no, they've already given their permission over here. So is that correct?
So they're providing their information through one portal, and then that information's being passed on to you.
Yes. And then we have to pass that information on to the next portal.
Well, then hopefully there'd be arrangements. Like you must have agreements around how.
They can't provide me one.
You need legal advice.
Excellent answer, Amy.
Hello, I'm Jane from Scouts WA. We've obviously got used to having preparations for physical protections around our volunteers, you know, first aid, ambulance, hospital, blah, blah, blah. Now with the mental health load, suggestions as to what kind of policies and implications do we have, because we don't have expertise in that area. We're not medical, but we have got the process for medical. What do you suggest that we do?
Yeah. So there was a court case about this last year, and in this case, a lady was exposed to the nature of her role meant that she was exposed to traumatic material, and she told her manager, and then her manager didn't do anything about it, and she went on stress leave, etc. And anyway, ended up going to court. And the things that the court said that the organisation should have done was have things like a rotational system. So if you know that a worker is having difficulties, having in place a system where it's optional to rotate out of those particular duties, about having regular welfare check-ins. So that's, I think, a really simple one. The other things that were some sort of practical tips that were given were the training the managers on what to look for. Having a policy in place was also another one around what people need to do if they're feeling overwhelmed, etc. And what else was there? Training, policies, rotational system, wellbeing check-ins. I think that's all I can think of for now. But I think it's just about understanding where your risks lie. So just like we would walk into a room and think about, well, where are our physical risks? That's where you need to start going into your programs and going, well, where are our risks? Where are people overworked, underworked? Where might they be exposed to traumatic material? Where might they be hearing client stories over and over and over again? You just need to start with a bit of a risk register, I think, is the first place to start. And then it's about, well, what would be a reasonable response to that risk? And remember, the law only requires you to have a reasonable response to the risk, right? In proportion to your organisation's resources, knowledge, expertise. So what Red Cross might do might be different to what a 2-person organisation might do. So it's this concept of reasonableness. Does that kind of answer your question? The work health and safety regulators have very, very specific examples for all of those hazards about what an organisation might do.
Sure. I think for our case is that we have volunteer managers. So it's not paid staff or qualified staff. Our managers on our ground base are volunteers themselves.
Yeah.
And the ethical, moral and legal obligation of those managers, we can educate them, but where's that line where you have a traumatised person, then an incidental traumatised to the volunteer manager? There's that, where's the line of responsibility for them when they're on the line and organisation?
As in who's responsible, the manager or the organisation?
Correct.
Under the work health and safety laws, a manager could also be responsible as well too. So, which is tricky, right? If the work health and safety laws apply to you, that's the first step. But if they do apply to you, you have dual responsibility. So workers also have a responsibility to take care of themselves under the work health and safety legislation. But it could be that you're both vicarious, you're both liable, I think is the answer.
Good afternoon. Can I just start by saying the three of you as SMEs in your field, your speaking style really come through on that one. It was just really, really lovely. Thank you. So my name is Milena. I'm with Cancer Council New South Wales. So my question's for Rebecca. I'm just really interested around when we're having a look. I'm all about equality, and I'll plug that gap problems also. Rebecca, just around looking at the SEEK website, and we're currently very actively recruiting at Cancer Council New South Wales, and we've done a lot of work in the last few years, around that sort of thing. And I've got a background of 25 years in recruitment. And so we've just set up a whole new team. So I've got a HR coordinator that's just gone to a lot of work in filling out platforms and portals and blah, blah, blah to get it out here and get it out there and all that sort of thing. So not so much from an efficiency perspective, but really something that stood out for me, what you were talking about was around people are scrolling through, but they're not actually checking in on things. So I love that you pulled out that you're looking at that position title, and that's something that I kind of looking at. You just want that buzzword to jump out, So you're looking at driver. That's really clear. It's conceptual. You know what that is. What else can we do? Because I'm having a look at that whole content and I'm seeing a lot of scrolling within one. And I've absolutely gone and checked out all of your sites as well. Maybe not quite literally, but pretty close. So really having a look at, how we present that content, what's the marketing space saying to us when we're looking at social media? What are the marketing guys saying to us?
Yeah, so to go very broad, to start with, one of the questions we've been thinking about is what's the minimum amount of information a volunteer needs to make a decision, right? And we are SEEK, so we've gone quite job-centric. And that's okay for skilled volunteer roles when they need to understand and it's more similar to a job. So one of the things we're considering and pondering is, well, what does that mean for general volunteer roles when they don't need all the information that we have in our postings form? So that comes back to us and going, okay, well, can we really strip out and have a couple of different posting forms depending on the type of volunteer role it is, so that we can present to the volunteer the right amount of information for that role. Katrina's she's very excited about this, but it's also a lot of work, but we're thinking about things that way, because I think there's a few different ways that we can cut the information and present things differently to the volunteer. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. We would love to. And most of the stuff we do, we'll look at, get some volunteers in and, follow them and see what they're looking at. Where are they stopping? We get all this crazy data about how many seconds they spend on a page or not and things like that. But then there's also the human element of just going, well, what are you thinking and where are you going? And then from your perspective, what's the minimum amount of information you need from a volunteer as well? Yeah. Yeah.
What gets their attention, and then looking at those different demographics. Now, I've got a bunch of these students putting all these marketing recommendations that you would probably love to have a bit of a read of on some projects they've done through to people adding Wagga and who knows who. So it's definitely not going to one solution for demographics, but there's the information. Yeah. We need to know when do we need to know it and how can we digest it.
Yeah.
And that really
Sounds like there's some collaboration opportunities.
Definitely. And one of the things Seek did, and this is different, but it comes into mind in this situation, is they actually built a spin-off business for hospitality, recognising that a barista, a waitress or someone just wants to know, where's the job, what hours, what's the roster and how much am I going to get paid? And the form is actually, I don't think the cafe puts in any sort of free text because they realise that's the minimum amount of information and bang, I'm there and I'm off. So so that's where we want to look at how do we sort of dissect the different type of volunteering roles and then present, because we present it all as one at the moment. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Just so
You can talk to it.
hello.
It's Katrina from my team.
Yeah, so what I was saying is there's also what we can do in the actual ad to attract the right volunteers to our opportunities. So we did a lot of work on the segmentation of what are the motivations or the intent of people coming to volunteer and looking at the different stages of someone's life stages, but also in terms of their intentions. And then trying, when we're writing opportunities, to think about, well, what is it that's going to attract someone to to a retail opportunity? What can we do if they're trying to gain skills and experience that will help them think, yeah, this is the opportunity for me? So putting into that context as well.
Hi, mine's also for Rebecca. Do you have a measurement for the amount of informal or episodic roles that you've advertised, or do you advertise those roles on Seek Volunteer?
We don't advertise informal volunteering, and I was in the informal volunteering workshop yesterday, and I don't even want to use that word now. So with Seek, from a risk perspective, you need to be a registered not-for-profit, and it's more around formal volunteer roles. So we don't capture sort of informal volunteering from that perspective. Other platforms do that. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, another WHS question. Mel from Delta Therapy Dog. So our volunteers go into hospitals, aged care, they're going into a third-party environment that we're putting them into. Do you think it's reasonable? Okay, so we'll add to our risk register all of those psychosocial care risks that we foresee, but because we're likely unaware of some of them, it's reasonable for us to be asking disclosure or collaboration with our hosts, because they have a duty for our volunteers as well.
Completely reasonable to be talking to the hospital.
Are they liable also, I imagine, because
It would depend on what would happen, but yeah, probably everyone is. Let's just face it. It's a very complex factual scenario around who would be liable and what your agreement with the hospital is, and what exactly happened. But yeah, I can't. Yeah, it all depends upon the facts and circumstances. But I think it's completely reasonable to talk to the hospital about what sort of risk they foresee, and to talk to the person that's going on site, right? So that's the biggest obligation that we have under work health and safety legislation, is to consult with our workers, right? About what are they seeing, what risks have they identified?
because as they would now go in and do a physical induction of, the hazards and things, they should probably be now doing a psychosocial care.
100% to what they're seeing in the hospital. Yeah, or whatever the setting is. Yeah.
Any other questions? Right down the front.
I was interested, Matt, whether you might have an answer to this, but I'm thinking about the, you were talking about expressions of interest are going down, but I'm wondering about the off diagonal around people who are looking. We know there's people that are looking to volunteer and have barriers to volunteering, but also we know that there are good opportunities to build knowledge and skills volunteering that will then position you well for paid work. So I'm interested to know, is there any way to connect the people that are not being successful in their paid work search to relevant volunteering roles that can then kind of give them an opportunity to think about building their knowledge and experience that will present them as a stronger candidate into the future. And sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Susan Hellyer from the Peak Body in ACT.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I mean, I guess the problem at the moment is that there's not that many people who are unsuccessful in their applications for paid work. You know, obviously some people are missing out, but what we see is when people come and apply for a job at Seek, the average number of applications per applicant used to be, several years ago, was a lot higher than it is now, because you'd have to apply for 3, 4, 5 jobs on average before you get one. Now that number's way down because each application has a higher probability of success. So at the moment, there's not that many people in that bucket who are at least, you know, persistently missing out on jobs. But I think moving forward, if we do expect unemployment to go up at least a bit, then yeah, I think that's a good idea of trying to identify opportunities to help people who are kind of locked out of the paid workforce to acquire skills and experience that would help them in future.
So we measure why people have chosen to express interest in a volunteer opportunity. And the 3 key things, unsurprising to you guys, but I'll add some percentages to them, is 40% of people are expressing interest because they want to have a social impact, 40% are applying because they want to progress their career, and 20% for social connection. That was pre-COVID. I reckon social connection's probably gone up a little bit. And so what we did is in April 2012, it's in the footer on Seek Volunteer, this research that's titled Putting Volunteering to Work. And we actually interviewed 450 hiring managers and said, what do you value in volunteering? What do you think about volunteering when you're looking at a resume and stuff like that? And there's a couple of content pieces on there for volunteers to help them choose the right opportunity to progress their career, whether it's for looking to change careers in terms of a different industry, whether it's to just build up their skills because they don't have any experience in that industry in paid work, so use volunteering, the industries that it's really relevant for, and then also then how to write it on your resume and then how to talk to it in an interview. And then we actually did a content piece that we tried to get Seek to push out for hiring managers, trying to encourage them to value volunteering more. So yeah, take a look at that, and there's some good information, some good statistics in there. Yeah.
Hi, this is for Amy. I'm Cecily. I'm from Volunteering WA, and I manage a corporate volunteering program.
Yes.
We just had a review, or WH review last year, and it was amazing. But one of the things,
what review?
A WHS review of the program. It was really great. But one of the things that myself and the consultant couldn't quite come to a firm decision on was, where does the WHS responsibility lie when we are facilitating the volunteers? So we work with corporates and we facilitate their employees to volunteer at other organisations. Where does the responsibility lie?
It's normally, the way that the legislation's phrased is in connection with work performed for that workplace, right? And so,
because they're technically still working for their company, like they're on employed leave for volunteering, so they're covered by their workers' comp and they're covered by their public liability insurance. But we also obviously make sure that our VIOs that we work with have the necessary insurances too.
This sounds like an absolute cop-out, and I actually don't even mean this to be funny, but I actually think that's a legal advice question.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah, and I
maybe
think
let's talk after.
Yeah.
About how we can tee that up for you.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not trying to cop out of answering that.
Can I just add to that? I used to look after NAB's employee volunteer program, and we had this conversation, and I just don't recall resolving it as a black and white answer. Yeah. So
a lot of these are facts. It's all facts and circumstances with work health and safety. That's why it's hard to have a concrete answer to some of these questions.
Amy, can you tell everyone how they need to get in touch with you if people do need legal advice?
So we do have limited eligibility criteria. So we only assist small to medium-sized organisations that assist marginalised or disadvantaged communities or individuals. So that's for our free legal assistance service. But if you just jump onto www.nfplaw.org.au, there's a big button that says apply for legal help. Yeah.
Question over there. Oh, in the middle.
I'm very happy to and maybe I can sort of tee that up with Volunteering Australia actually when we disseminate the materials. I would be really happy to do that.
Hi, I'm David from Volunteering WA. My question's for Matt. Just in terms of the job advertisement data that you're seeing, are you seeing any difference in trends between full-time jobs being advertised and that of part-time and casual?
Over the last couple of years, it has been full-time jobs that have been the strongest. So the ABS data says something similar, which is that the proportion of employees who work part-time is slightly down on pre-COVID. The proportion of employees who are casual is down a bit more substantially on pre-COVID levels. So not only has there been strong employment growth, it has been concentrated in full-time jobs, not exclusively, but yeah, that's been the main source of growth.
Thought I saw a hand up over there. Yeah.
Hi, it's Tracy here from the RDA up in Darwin. A question for EMA, and it's kind of following on from the previous question. In the child safe space, we get support workers that come with some of our volunteers, and our committee has asked us to implement the framework around
child safe standards.
For the support workers. The question we had was, should their organisations have them checks already in place? And can we rely on their organisations to have done the right thing? Or should we be checking as well?
So you have an arrangement with an external organisation that sets up, that partners support workers with your young people, right? And so you're wondering whether or not who should be doing the checks.
Yeah, so their organisation should be doing the right thing and doing their checks in regards to...
You could ask for evidence of it.
Okay.
Evidence of I think that's a really smart thing to start, is to make sure that you know that they're doing those checks. A lot of these, so it depends, right? So some checks are legally required by law, so you would need to check whether under your legislation you're required to do the actual check. Some checks are about risk management. Right. And so I think that's the first question that you need to understand whether or not you need to do it. Then the second question is, if you don't, what do you need to satisfy yourself from a risk management point of view? Is it that you just check in with that organisation to check for evidence that they've done those checks? Or does your board or your senior management want more evidence, including getting their own checks? Yeah. So I feel like you need to answer that first question first.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Up the back there, and I'll go up this side.
Thanks for the presentations. I found them really insightful. I'm Beck and I'm from PwC, and I'd love to join in the conversation because I have the same queries when we're talking about corporate volunteers and working with third parties, so that's going to be a good one. But I am really interested in the points you made around, instead of sort of focusing on any negatives or the additional burden on VIOs to, respond to these changes, but actually the positive outcomes that these changes are trying to drive and ensure. Have you seen any examples in the international space or organisations here in Australia who have already started to respond to these changes and are doing it well?
Is that for me around sexual harassment laws or?
Also around, so like psychosocial hazards.
Justice Connect. Volunteering Australia. I don't off the top of my head. I'm sorry. Sorry.
No, all good.
Yeah. Sorry, that's.
Hi, it's Tracy here from Salvo Stores. I have a question around privacy laws. So we engage with a lot of third-party providers that refer volunteers to us on programs. And one of our internal policies is that all our volunteers have to have a valid police check. But a lot of them are saying, because of the privacy law, even though they've done that through their provider organisation, that they can't give me that information about the volunteer they're expecting us to host in our workplace. Can I push back to them and say, well, actually, it's a requirement. You've done it on the person you're expecting us to host in our workplace. You need to provide it to us.
I guess for them, what the hold up would be is that they're not telling. So when that person's applying to them and providing their personal information, then the obligations around privacy law are to tell people what you're doing with their personal information, right? And so they're not providing it to you probably because in their personal information collection statement, it doesn't say, and we will provide that information on to our third parties. So what you need to do is ask them to change their personal collection statement. I think
we're now required to do the checks again on someone who's just done it for their provider or whatever organisation they're with, because they won't give it to us.
So normally what third party, what they want to know is that you are complying with the Privacy Act as well too. So normally that's how it works between when there's multiple parties collecting information. Every party wants to satisfy themselves that the other party is complying with the Privacy Act. So they'll probably ask for assurance from you that you are complying with the Australian privacy principles. I think it's just about a conversation. I think it's just talking to them about the fact that you're doing this double handling and it's silly and costly. It's silly. It's resource intensive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that you comply with the APPs and that they just redraft their personal information collection statement to allow information to be passed on to you. Okay. That's probably what's holding. I mean, I don't know. I don't work for them. I don't have no idea what's going on for them, but I'm imagining that's what's happening for them.
Cool. Thank you.
I'm Jill PC. I manage the volunteer programs for national parks in South Australia. We've just been grappling with this very issue. And what we've done is, instead of keeping the information on file, we've now destroyed all those previous records. And we're just noting down on in a system that we've actually cited that, or we received the confirmation of their national police check or their working with children check, whatever it might be. So if another party needed that information, we can look up that data and just go, yes, we can verify that we cited the information, they have the check. Is that not enough? So because we're not allowed to keep the information.
You're still passing on personal information though, right? So that's what is your question.
I'm talking about the same thing. Sorry, I'm Philippa from Department of Communities in WA. We have a program where we discount checks for volunteers. We ask the organisation who's registered to pass that check on to the volunteer so they can then pass it on to different organisations. They're passing their own check through.
That's a better way to do it.
And it also stops organisations and volunteers having to pay for multiple checks in a 6-month time frame or something like that. So they're responsible for that, and the organisation is prescribed to pass that
and
back.
then it's their choice to pass it on. It's their information. I think that's a much,
And we've got time for one last question or comment.
I know. I was just going to add something very similar, was that we often take university students in a volunteer capacity, and in order to take on that sort of information, we have another form that goes out to the students where we ask, is it okay if we provide this information? And that way it's not double collected, but we have permission from those people.
It's all about consent. The Privacy Act is really logical like that. So as long as you have someone's consent to do things with their personal information, then it's okay.
Right, we're right on time, I'm very pleased to say. So could you join me in thanking Amy, Rebecca and Matt